when we're feeling these waves of grief, it's almost as if we are going to disappear in it. It's so big, we feel like we might not survive it. The energy of it feels so epic in that way that we think, I don't know if I can tolerate this. I can't make it through this. Tears come. And as a really wise teacher once said to me, grieve with everything you have and show the universe that something important was lost, that you feel the loss of something important. Give it everything you got.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melly, and I'm very grateful to be here sitting in the circle with all of you.
Hi,
Such a
Melly.
beautiful place to be. So grateful. I've been thinking a lot, especially about grieving and what we do as people in recovery that have lost loved ones or friends through addiction or whatever, and just how we could go about healing that. And my experience is that I came into recovery because my husband at the time, about 20, 21 years ago, went into the hospital for the very first time, and I was told that he had a 10% chance of surviving. And thank goodness, through the higher power, he did do that. And that's when I came into recovery. And I wanted it more than anything else in the world. And I really worked very hard and diligent going through Alcoholics Anonymous and the steps and having a sponsor and just praying. And the other thing I want to add to that is, a few years ago, I found Tommy. And I'm just so grateful because it opened my world more to more than just about not drinking and not just going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, but also to find out more about myself more deeply. And I'm just so grateful for that. The sad part of that beginning of that story is I did divorce my husband after 32 years of marriage. And 6 months after that, he died. He passed away. And the beautiful part about that was that I was there holding his hand for the last 3 months that he was in the hospital, and we made peace and forgiveness with our past. So being in recovery and just knowing that there's so many losses, and even the loss of ourselves sometimes is pretty severe, when we put down whatever we're addicted to and find out we're not that person anymore. So how are we going to heal from it? But also, the other part of my story, and I was sharing this not too long ago, was that my middle child, my second son, came to live with me about 2 years ago. And he came broken with untreated alcoholism. Although he went to meetings, he found a sponsor, he was doing book study, but he was still drinking. And then COVID came along, which really, changed everybody's lives as far as in-person meetings. And just for me to go through the grief, become a caregiver for a child, going through the grief of watching someone twice, and even more so, just watching other people in recovery just lose this battle, when just hearing other people talk about how they get into recovery. It can be done. I know, I believe I'm an example of how it can be done, doing service work and everything. But, as I think about grieving and the processes that we go through, and I know, Tommy, you've talked about grieving a lot, and you've had so much guidance and so many tools for us to use, that I thought maybe in this particular inquiry, you can just kind of refresh that for maybe people that have come in and don't know how to, newcomers that don't know how to let go of their old self, or
Mm.
people that lost other people. And I have sponsees that I've worked with that have gone out and I don't see them. They'll come back, but they'll go out. And sometimes we just have to let go with love and pray, and
Mm.
just know that we have to be strong in our path and share our stories about what it means to actually find this path of recovery, which I'm grateful to be in. So I
Mm.
hope that everything I said makes sense.
Yes.
But I just love being here. So thank you. Thank you for what you have to share.
Thank you, Melly, so much. Okay. So grief, as you eloquently expressed, grief takes many forms, and the causes of grief are numerous. Let's begin with the grief that most of us think of when we think of that word, or have felt when we have felt the emotion of grief, which is to lose another human being, to lose somebody dear to us. Grief is extremely powerful as an emotion, as we all know. When it happens, it comes in very intense waves. And what I'm speaking about here is a person who's actually able to allow it, where it happens. It is possible for a person to stuff grief, which is unbelievably toxic. Maybe one of those emotions, the most toxic to stuff down, swallow it down, your grief, and not feel it. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'm speaking about the person who's able to experience this emotion to some degree when they have lost somebody or something that's been near or dear to them. So there's grief, the emotion, which we feel in waves, very intense. When we're feeling these waves of grief, it's almost as if we are going to disappear in it. It's so big, we feel like we might not survive it. The energy of it feels so epic in that way that we think, I don't know if I can tolerate this. I can't make it through this. Tears come. And as a really wise teacher once said to me, I was grieving, and I'll talk about it, but I was grieving at that moment, and the teacher said to me, grieve with everything you have. Grieve with everything you have, and show the universe that something important was lost, that you feel the loss of something important. Give it everything you got. And I feel that was incredibly powerful advice, giving me permission to really, really let it come. To really, really let it come. That none of this was going to be held back. And there was going to be this, it didn't matter. I can remember being in cafes, crying, grieving, and I mean by myself, ugly crying, like ugly, bubbles coming out of the nose, the whole deal, ugly, collapsing, just laid out completely, and feeling those waves and feeling the associated feelings that come with grief, sometimes anger, and obviously intense sadness. Sometimes you just need to scream at the sky. How could this be? How could this be? In recovery, we see loss that we perceive as ill-timed or poorly timed, or people who go before their time, because we see people who are living in addiction, who are suffering the ravages of substance abuse, be that alcoholism or a drug, what have you. And then we see all the associative disorders, the psychological disorders, depression, suicide, all of it, to me, all of it sort of in the same realm, if you will, same realm of human suffering. And so we see and we experience the death of others in recovery. Very often, it feels wrong somehow that this person didn't have to go this early, or I wish they could have lived a full life, or I wish they didn't suffer behind addiction. And so there's that story. And that story comes together with emotion. And that story enmeshes itself into the emotion of grief. And it makes the grief much, much, much more painful and long-lasting. A story attached to grief will often not allow the grief to end. If you stay stuck in the story that's attached to the grief, you'll stay stuck in the grief that's attached to the story. A lot of people miss this very important understanding, because the story is usually not true, but nonetheless, there it is. There's a story attached to this grief, and I don't seem to be able to get through it. So people grieve sometimes for months and months, or years and years, or decades and decades. It's one thing to feel sad, but it's another thing to feel grief. Two different things. So let me give you an example of the way that story can enmesh itself with grief. If somebody dies, let's say a child or somebody's child, maybe even a grown-up, maybe they're in their 30s, and we have many, many, many people in Recovery 2.0 like this who have shared their losses of their children, and they feel as parents responsible. It's my fault. I behaved addictively in my child's adolescence, and I contributed to their insecurity, depression, their addiction, and they died from it, and it's my fault. Now, that story has to be worked out. When that story of it's my fault and this person's gone, that's a haunting combination that will follow a person around for the rest of their life until they can work out that story. And to me, that's just simply not a true story, because we're not responsible for the life of another, even our children. And we forget that, especially as parents. We don't own these children. These children are on loan to us from the spirit beyond. They have a relationship with their higher power the same way we do. They have a path. They have a destiny. They have a life that they must follow. They have decisions that they have to make. And the decisions that they make are not based upon anything except an infinite number of decisions that were made previously up to that point. One would say, from the yogic perspective, their karma is theirs. It wasn't given to them. Now, this brings up a lot of confusion for people, because people often feel, no, you're wrong, Tommy. It is my fault. I did this, I did that, I did the other thing. If I had done something different, something else would have happened. Well, of course, that's true. Anyone could say that under any circumstance. But when I really talk to these parents, I say, you gave your love to your child. Yes, but I could have done better. Okay. Any parent can say that. And at the end of the discussion of what really, really looking at their grief, they'll recognize that they did the best they could with what they had under the circumstances at that time. And that was their karma. And this interconnected web of infinite numbers of events and decisions, thoughts, beliefs, actions came together into the unfolding of reality as it has been experienced. That story has to be worked out so the grief and these waves of emotion can move freely through you. The emotion enmeshed with the grief, the story enmeshed with the grief is like a dam damming up a river, and it just can't flow. And so one stays in that grief and one stays in that suffering until that story can be worked out. The story is coming from where? The ego, of course. This is a matter of the ego. And so if the story is keeping you stuck in your grief, I could have done better. I wish I had been there to say goodbye. There's a little story that people carry. My father had told me, so many times in his life, I just don't want to die alone. I just don't want to die alone. He'd say this like, it was a little bit like hard for us to hear after a while, because it was like, Dad, you've been saying that your entire life. We get it. We've heard you. But my dad died in the middle of the night and nobody was there with him. Now I could build a whole big story around that. Oh my God, the one thing my dad asked me in his moment of death, I couldn't deliver on that. I'm a terrible son. I could build that story, but I don't find that story to be true. And so I've been able to grieve and ponder, contemplate, and feel the tremendous loss that I felt when my father left his body. But that story was not going to be one of the stories that I picked up. And if I had picked it up, it would have kept me stuck in this grief. Now, grief of another also includes grief of our losing our animals and these beloved beings that we get to spend time with, our dogs, our cats, our birds, our horses, our cows. People have very powerful relationships with animals as well. And I want to mention it because I know the grief of losing a cat, for example, my kitty, Melly, who was with me for 19 years. And when she died, I had a story, big story. I wasn't there when she died. I went off on a 4-day business meeting. She was sick, really, really sick for a long time. And when I left, I said, please be here when I get back. And 2 days into my trip, my wife called and said, I have to put her down right now. She's taken a turn for the worse. And so over Zoom, I watched as they put my little kitty to sleep. And I wept and wept and wept and wept. I couldn't put it down for a long time. And when I looked at it, it was the story. Why did I leave? Why didn't I put her down myself before I left? I knew how sick she was. There was this one point a week ago where she knocked her head into my shin bone. She was trying to tell me to let her go. Why didn't I hear, these kinds of stories over and over and over again in my head, keeping me stuck in the pain of grief. And then a wise counselor was able to say to me, you know what? For 19 years, you gave this amazing, loving creature an amazing life. And your ego is having you limit the loss of her to what happened on one particular day. And I was able to release the misperception that I had in that story of I'm a bad person. I'm not a good pet owner. I missed a signal that I should have seen. How could I have missed this? So that had to be worked out in order for me to release that grief. Then you speak about the grief that we experience when we let go of a substance or we let go of a behavior that has been hurtful, that has come to the point where we know we need to let it go, as we've spoken about. For me, I could speak easily about the grief of letting go of cannabis. One of the longest, most sultry love affairs I've ever had, without question. My relationship with cannabis. Wow. And it was so powerful and so embedded in my psyche. It was such a dependency, had become such a part of my life, my community, my effort to be connected to other people, everything. It was related to everything for me. And when I went off to treatment, a friend of mine said, well, I understand you're going to let go of alcohol and cocaine and heroin, but you're not going to stop smoking pot, are you? And I remember saying, no treatment center in the world could get me to stop smoking pot. That was literally my words going off to treatment. Like, that's how big that relationship was for me. And when I started to understand through treatment and in the ensuing months that I really needed to let this thing go, and I understood the depth to which it had gotten in the way of my happiness, and I started to understand what it had taken away from me. There was an anger. There was a sadness, a lot of tears, a lot of questioning, a lot of confusion. For a little while, a lot of relapsing. Let me go back and try again. Let me go back and try again. Until I was able to finally let it go. And the power of it was such that it had embedded itself so deeply in my psyche that about a year into it, a year of full abstinence and full sobriety, I started to have a series of very intense nightmares about it. I was having these relapse dreams. And through the relapse dreams, in the dream, I would wake up a series of days having smoked cannabis, and then wake up the next morning and feel the guilt and the sadness of having lost my recovery. And then I would finally wake up for real out of the dream and wake up into our reality here. And I was so confused about whether I had used smoke pot or not. I actually didn't know. The grief was so epic for me that it had to be cleansed out of my subconscious mind by dreams. And a teacher pointed out to me, they said, "How did you feel in the dream when you used cannabis?" And I said, "Well, I felt remorse and sadness that I had lost my recovery." And they said, "Only a person who really wants recovery would feel that way." And it became a gift for me that I recognized the depth to which I actually wanted this thing. And I actually mark it as a benchmark for when another depth of recovery took place for me. When I was finally able to move past my grief of letting go of cannabis and what it had meant for me and how big it had been for me. And I imagine now in our society with cannabis being legal, and I know when I walk down the street in New York City, I mean, it just smells like pot everywhere. I know that a lot of people are going to be struggling like I was around this. And I want them to know that it's okay. And that there's such an incredible life beyond it, if only you'll give yourself a chance to experience it. Finally, Melly, I want to say the longer we're in recovery, the more opportunities we're going to have to practice grief. And you could say the longer we're alive, the more opportunities we're going to have. Hopefully, we begin to understand the difference between the emotion and the power of grief itself and the egoic stories that are attached to that grief. And that we can begin to separate those things and resolve the story and move through the grief. Because grief is a beautiful thing, painful as it is. It really is part of our experience of humanity. We lose people that are dear to us. And we lose them from physical form, but we don't really lose them. But our relationship with them becomes much more subtle. And so in the grief, we can start to attune ourselves to something more subtle. I cannot find my father in physical form. He's not here. I can't call him on the phone. I actually accidentally, unconsciously called him on the phone a few months after he died. I dialed his number. The phone rang. Nobody picked up. I hung up the phone. I caught myself. "Tommy, what are you doing? You can't reach him that way. It's okay." That communication has to happen in more subtle ways. And of course, the memory and the beauty of having experienced that with, that kind of love with somebody. Just amazing. And we live another day. And the band plays on. And we connect. And we do our work. And we continue to awaken until that last breath, that last exhale, when we get to experience that next level of subtlety and move along in our journey, which is pretty clear, I think, at this point, doesn't end with this body. Just doesn't. So it's a great mystery. And that's an element of this inquiry as well. We must embrace it. I do not have the vision to see what happens beyond this, but I do have the ability to practice and to attune myself to something more subtle and to have glimpses and experiences of something beyond what we experience through our five senses. You have that ability too. Everybody does. So I'm grateful for your inquiry. I'd love to know what comes up for you in this discussion, in this answer, and in this exploration.
First of all, thank you, Tommy, for sharing those gifted words that you had shared with us from the beginning of the conversation right to the end. And, it makes me think of a story, that word we've used a lot, I guess, today, about my son. He would sit in my sun porch and ponder and think, and it faced woods. And he would see a one little dainty yellow butterfly that would fly by often. And he kept saying to me, Mom, I keep seeing this yellow butterfly. And I'd look around and I didn't see it. Sure enough, eventually I did see the yellow butterfly. So when I see a yellow butterfly, I think of my son. And I'm just grateful that I have resources like Recovery 2.0. I went through a lot of therapy, um, a sponsor to share, and other people in recovery to share, and also grief shares. So there are a lot of great avenues to help us as we continue to go through grieving, because it's part of life. Grateful to be here, and I thank you again with love from my heart to yours.
Love right back to you, Melly. Love you so. And thank you for this inquiry and for being in the circle with us today.